Book presents The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Part 1, Book 2, An Unfortunate Gathering. Chapter 5, So Be It, So Be It.
The elder's absence from his cell had lasted for about 25 minutes. It was more than 12:30, but Dmitri, on whose account they had all met there, had still not appeared. But he seemed almost to be forgotten, and when the elder entered the cell again, he found his guests engaged in eager conversation. Ivan and the two monks took the leading share in it. Miusov, too, was trying to take a part, and apparently very eagerly, in the conversation. But he was unsuccessful in this also. He was evidently in the background, and his remarks were treated with neglect, which increased his irritability. He had had intellectual encounters with Ivan before, and he could not endure a certain carelessness Ivan showed him. Hitherto, at least, I have stood in the front ranks of all that is progressive in Europe, and here the new generation positively ignores us, he thought. Fyodor Pavlovitch, who had given his word to sit still and be quiet, had actually been quiet for some time, but he watched his neighbor Miusov with an ironical little smile, obviously enjoying his discomfiture. He had been waiting for some time to pay off old scores, and now he could not let the opportunity slip. Bending over his shoulder, he began teasing him again in a whisper. "Why didn't you go away just now, after the courteously kissing? Why did you consent to remain in such unseemly company? It was because you felt insulted and aggrieved, and you remained to vindicate yourself by showing off your intelligence. Now you won't go till you've displayed your intellect to them." "You again? On the contrary, I'm just going." "You'll be the last of all to go." Fyodor Pavlovitch delivered him another thrust, almost at the moment of Father Zossima's return. The discussion died down for a moment, but the elder, seating himself in his former place, looked at them all as though cordially inviting them to go on. Alyosha, who knew every expression of his face, saw that he was fearfully exhausted and making a great effort. Of late he had been liable to fainting fits from exhaustion. His face had the pallor that was common before such attacks, and his lips were white. But he evidently did not want to break up the party. He seemed to have some special object of his own in keeping them. What object? Alyosha watched him intently. "We are discussing this gentleman's most interesting article," said Father Iosif, the librarian, addressing the elder, and indicating Ivan. "He brings forward much that is new, but I think the argument cuts both ways. It is an article written in answer to a book by an ecclesiastical authority on the question of ecclesiastical court and the scope of its jurisdiction." "I'm sorry I have not read your article, but I've heard of it," said the elder, looking keenly and intently at Ivan. "He takes up a most interesting position," continued the father librarian. "As far as church jurisdiction is concerned, he is apparently quite opposed to the separation of church from state." "That's interesting. But in what sense?" Father Zossima asked Ivan. The latter at last answered him, not condescendingly, as Alyosha had feared, but with modesty and reserve, with evident goodwill, and apparently without the slightest arrière-pensée. "I start from a position that this confusion of elements, that is, of the essential principles of church and state, will, of course, go on forever, in spite of the fact that it is impossible for them to mingle, and that the confusion of these elements cannot lead to any consistent or even normal results, for there is falsity at the very foundation of it. Compromise between the church and state in such question as, for instance, jurisdiction, is, to my thinking, impossible to any real sense. My clerical opponent maintains that the church holds a precise and defined position in the state. I maintain, on the contrary, that the church ought to include the whole state, and not simply to occupy a corner in it. And if this is, for some reason, impossible at present, then it ought, in reality, to be set up as the direct and chief aim of the future development of Christian society." "Perfectly true." Father Pacy, the silent and learned monk, assented with fervor and decision. "The purest ultramontanism," cried Miusov impatiently, crossing and recrossing his legs. "Oh, well, we have no mountains," cried Father Iosif, and turning to the elder he continued, Observe the answer he makes to the following fundamental and essential propositions of his opponent, who is, you must note, an ecclesiastic. First, that no social organization can or ought to arrogate to itself power to dispose of the civic and political rights of its members. Secondly, that criminal and civil jurisdiction ought not to belong to the Church and is inconsistent with its nature, both as a divine institution and as an organization of men for religious objects. And finally, in the third place, the Church is a kingdom not of this world. A most unworthy play upon words for an ecclesiastic. Father Pacey could not refrain from breaking in again. I have read the book which you have answered, he added, addressing Ivan, and was astounded at the words, the Church is a kingdom not of this world. If it is not of this world, then it cannot exist on earth at all. In the Gospel, the words not of this world are not used in that sense. To play with such words is indefensible. Our Lord Jesus Christ came to set up the Church upon earth. The kingdom of heaven, of course, is not of this world, but in heaven. But it is only entered through the Church which has been founded and established upon earth. And so a frivolous play upon words in such a connection is unpardonable and improper. The Church is, in truth, a kingdom and ordained to rule, and in the end must undoubtedly become the kingdom ruling over all the earth. For that we have the divine promise. He ceased speaking suddenly, as though checking himself. After listening attentively and respectfully, Ivan went on, addressing the elder with perfect composure and as before with ready cordiality. The whole point of my article lies in the fact that during the first 3 centuries, Christianity only existed on earth in the Church and was nothing but the Church. When the pagan Roman Empire decided to become Christian, it inevitably happened that, by becoming Christian, it included the Church but remained a pagan state in very many of its departments. In reality, this was bound to happen. But Rome as a state retained too much of the pagan civilization and culture as, for example, in the very objects and fundamental principles of the state. The Christian Church entering into the state could, of course, surrender no part of its fundamental principles, the rock on which it stands, and could pursue no other aims than those which have been ordained and revealed by God himself, and among them that of drawing the whole world, and therefore the ancient pagan state itself, into the Church. In that way, it is not the Church that should seek a definite position in the state, like every social organization, or as an organization of men for religious purposes. But, on the contrary, every earthly state should be, in the end, completely transformed into the Church and should become nothing else but the Church, rejecting every purpose incongruous with the aims of the Church. All this will not degrade it in any way or take from its honor and glory as a great state, nor from the glory of its rulers, but only turns it from false, still pagan, and mistaken path to the true and rightful path, which alone leads to the eternal goal. This is why the author of the book on the foundations of church jurisdiction would have judged correctly if, in seeking and laying down those foundations, he had looked upon them as a temporary compromise inevitable in our sinful and imperfect days. But as soon as the author ventures to declare that the foundations which he predicates now, part of which Father Iosif just enumerated, are the permanent, essential, and eternal foundations, he is going directly against the Church and its sacred and eternal vocation. That is the gist of my article. That is, in brief, Father Pacey began again, laying stress on each word. According to certain theories only too clearly formulated in the 19th century, the Church ought to be transformed into the state, as though this would be an advance from a lower to a higher form, so as to disappear into it, making way for science, for the spirit of the age and civilization. And if the Church resists and is unwilling, some corner will be set apart for her in the state, and even that under control, and this will be so everywhere in all modern Europe countries. But Russian hopes and conceptions demand not that the Church should pass hence from a lower into a higher type into the state, but, on the contrary, that the state should end by being worthy to become only the Church and nothing else. So be it, so be it. Well, I confess you've assured me somewhat, Miusov said, smiling, again crossing his legs. So far as I understand, then, the realization of such an ideal is infinitely remote. At the second coming of Christ, that's as you please. It's a beautiful utopian dream of the abolition of war, diplomacy, banks, and so on. Something after the fashion of socialism, indeed. But I imagine that it was all meant seriously, and that the church might be now going to try criminals and sentence them to beating, prison, and even death. But if there were none but the ecclesiastical court, the church would not even now sentence a criminal to prison or to death. Crime and the way of regarding it would inevitably change, not all at once, of course, but fairly soon. Ivan replied calmly, without flinching. Are you serious? Miusov glanced keenly at him. If everything became the church would exclude all the criminal and disobedient, and would not cut off their heads. Ivan went on. I ask you, what would become of the excluded? He would be cut off then not only from men, as now, but from Christ. By his crime he would have transgressed not only against men, but against the church of Christ. This is so even now, of course, strictly speaking, but it is not clearly enunciated. And very, very often the criminal of today compromises with his conscience. I steal, he says, but I don't go against the church. I'm not an enemy of Christ. That's what the criminal of today is continually saying to himself. But when the church takes the place of the state, it will be difficult for him, in opposition to the church all over the world, to say, all men are mistaken, all in error, all mankind are the false church. I, a thief and murderer, am the only true Christian church. It will be very difficult to say this to himself. It requires a rare combination of unusual circumstances. Now, on the other side, take the church's own view of crime. Is it not bound to renounce the present almost pagan attitude and to change from a mechanical cutting off of its tainted member for the preservation of society, as at present, into completely and honestly adopting the idea of the regeneration of the man, of his reformation and salvation? What do you mean? I fail to understand again, Miusov interrupted. Some sort of dream again, something shapeless and even incomprehensible. What is excommunication? What sort of exclusion? I suspect you are simply amusing yourself, Ivan Fyodorovich. Yes, but you know, in reality it is so now, said the elder suddenly, and all turned to him at once. If it were not for the Church of Christ, there would be nothing to restrain the criminal from evil doing, no real chastisement for it afterwards. None, that is, but mechanical punishment spoken of just now, which in the majority of cases only embitters the heart, and not the real punishment, the only effectual one, the only deterrent and softening one, which lies in the recognition of sin by conscience. How is that, may one inquire? Asked Miusov, with lively curiosity. Why, began the elder, all these sentences to exile with hard labor, and formerly with flogging also, reform no one, and what's more, deter hardly a single criminal, and the number of crimes does not diminish but is continually on the increase. You must admit that. Consequently, the security of society is not preserved, for although the obnoxious member is mechanically cut off and sent far away out of sight, another criminal always comes to take his place at once, and often two of them. If anything does preserve society, even in our time, and thus regenerate and transform the criminal, it is only the law of Christ speaking in his conscience. It is only by recognizing his wrongdoing as the son of a Christian society, that is, of the church, that he recognizes his sin against society, that is, against the church, so that it is only against the church and not against the state, that the criminal of today can recognize that he has sinned. If society as a church had jurisdiction, then it would know when to bring back from exclusion and to reunite to itself. Now the church, having no real jurisdiction, but only the power of moral condemnation, withdraws of her own accord from punishing the criminal actively. She does not excommunicate him, but simply persists in motherly exhortation of him. What is more, the church even tries to preserve all Christian communion with the criminal. She admits him to church services, to the Holy Sacrament, gives him alms, and treats him more as a captive than as a convict. And what would become of the criminal, O Lord, if even the Christian society, that is, the church, were to reject him even as the civil law rejects him and cuts him off? what would become of him if the Church punished him with her excommunication as the direct consequence of the secular law? There could be no more terrible despair, at least for a Russian criminal, for Russian criminals to have faith. Though, who knows, perhaps then a fearful thing would happen. Perhaps the despairing heart of the criminal would lose its faith, and then what would become of him? But the Church, like a tender, loving mother, holds aloof from active punishment herself, as the sinner is too severely punished already by the civil law, and there must be at least someone to have pity on him. The Church holds aloof, above all, because its judgment is the only one that contains the truth, and therefore cannot practically and morally be united to any other judgment, even as a temporary compromise. She can enter into no compact about that. The foreign criminal, they say, rarely repents, for the very doctrines of today confirm him in the idea that his crime is not a crime, but only a reaction against an unjustly oppressive force. Society cuts him off completely by a force that triumphs over him mechanically and accompanies this exclusion with hatred, forgetfulness, and the most profound indifference as to the ultimate fate of the erring brother. In this way, it all takes place without the compassionate intervention of the Church, for in many cases there are no churches there at all. For though ecclesiastics and splendid church buildings remain, the churches themselves have long ago striven to pass from church into state and to disappear in it completely. So it seems, at least in Lutheran countries. As for Rome, it was proclaimed a state instead of a church 1,000 years ago. And so the criminal is no longer conscious of being a member of the church and sinks into despair. If he returns to society, often it is with such hatred that society itself instinctively cuts him off. You can judge for yourself how it must end. In many cases, it would seem to be the same with us, but the difference is that besides the established law courts, we have the church too, which always keeps up relations with the criminal as a dear and still precious son. And besides that, there is still preserved, though only in thought, the judgment of the Church, which though no longer existing in practice is still living as a dream for the future, and is, no doubt, instinctively recognized by the criminal in his soul. What was said here just now is true too. That is, that if the jurisdiction of the Church were introduced in practice in its full force, that is, if the whole of the society were changed into the Church, not only the judgment of the Church would have influence on the reformation of the criminal, such as it never has now, but possibly also the crimes themselves would be incredibly diminished, and there can be no doubt that the Church would look upon the criminal and the crime of the future in many cases quite differently, and would succeed in restoring the excluded, in restraining those who plan evil, and in regenerating the fallen. It is true, said Father Zossima with a smile. The Christian society now is not ready and is only resting on some 7 righteous men, but as they are never lacking, it will continue still unshaken in expectation of its complete transformation from a society almost heathen in character into a single universal and all-powerful church. So be it, so be it. Even though at the end of the ages, for it is ordained to come to pass, and there is no need to be troubled about times and seasons, for the secret of the times and seasons is in the wisdom of God, in his foresight and his love, and what in human reckoning seems still afar off, may by the divine ordinance be close at hand, on the eve of its appearance. And so be it, so be it. So be it, so be it, Father Pacey repeated austerely and reverently. Strange, extremely strange, Miusov pronounced, not so much with heat as with latent indignation. What strikes you as so strange? Father Iosif inquired cautiously. Why, it's beyond anything, cried Miusov, suddenly breaking out. The state is eliminated and the church is raised to the position of the state. It's not simply ultramontanism, it's arch-ultramontanism. It's beyond the dreams of Pope Gregory VII. You are completely misunderstanding it, said Father Pacey sternly. Understand, the church is not to be transformed into the state. That is Rome and its dream. That is the third temptation of the devil. On the contrary, the state is transformed into the church, will ascend and become a church over the whole world, which is the complete opposite of ultramontanism and Rome and your interpretation, and is only the glorious destiny ordained for the Orthodox Church. This star will rise in the east. Miusov was significantly silent. His whole figure expressed extraordinary personal dignity. A supercilious and condescending smile played on his lips. Alyosha watched it all with a throbbing heart. The whole conversation stirred him profoundly. He glanced casually at Rakitin, who was standing immovable in his place by the door, listening and watching intently, though with downcast eyes. But from the color in his cheeks, Alyosha guessed that Rakitin was probably no less excited, and he knew what caused his excitement. "Allow me to tell you one little anecdote, gentlemen," Miusov said impressively, with a peculiarly majestic air. "Some years ago, soon after the coup d'etat of December, I happened to be calling in Paris on an extremely influential personage in the government, and I met a very interesting man in his house. This individual was not precisely a detective, but was a sort of superintendent of a whole regiment of political detectives, a rather powerful position in its own way. I was prompted by curiosity to seize the opportunity of conversation with him, and as he had not come as a visitor but as a subordinate official bringing a special report, and as he saw the reception given me by his chief, he deigned to speak with some openness, to a certain extent only, of course. He was rather courteous than open, as Frenchmen know how to be courteous, especially to a foreigner. But I thoroughly understood him. The subject was the socialist revolutionaries who were at that time persecuted. I will quote only one most curious remark dropped by this person. 'We are not particularly afraid,' said he, 'of all these socialists, anarchists, infidels, and revolutionists. We keep watch on them and know all their goings-on. But there are a few peculiar men among them who believe in God and are Christians, but at the same time are socialists. These are the people we are most afraid of. They are dreadful people. The socialist who is a Christian is more to be dreaded than a socialist who is an atheist.' The words struck me at the time, and now they have suddenly come back to me here, gentlemen. 'You apply them to us, and look upon us as socialists?' Father Pacey asked directly, without beating about the bush. But before Pyotr Alexandrovich could think what to answer, the door opened, and the guest so long expected, Dmitri Fyodorovich, came in. They had, in fact, given up expecting him, and his sudden appearance caused some surprise for a moment.
Chapter 6. Why is such a man alive?
Dmitri Fyodorovich, a young man of 28, of medium height and agreeable countenance, looked older than his years. He was muscular and showed signs of considerable physical strength. Yet there was something not healthy in his face. He was rather thin, his cheeks were hollow, and there was an unhealthy sallowness in their color. His rather large, prominent dark eyes had an expression of firm determination, and yet there was a fake look in them too. Even when he was excited and talking irritably, his eyes somehow did not follow his mood, but betrayed something else, sometimes quite incongruous with what was passing. It is hard to tell what he's thinking. Those who talked to him sometimes declared. People who saw something pensive and sullen in his eyes were startled by his sudden laugh, which bore witness to mirthful and light-hearted thoughts at the very time when his eyes were so gloomy. A certain strained look in his face was easy to understand at this moment. Everyone knew, or had heard of, the extremely restless and dissipated life which he had been leading of late, as well as of the violent anger to which he had been roused in his quarrels with his father. There were several stories current in the town about it. It is true that he was irascible by nature, of an unstable and unbalanced mind, as our Justice of the Peace, Kachalnikov, happily described him. He was stylishly and irreproachably dressed in a carefully buttoned frock coat. He wore black gloves and carried a top hat. Having only lately left the army, he still had moustaches and no beard. His dark brown hair was cropped short and combed forward on his temples. He had the long, determined stride of a military man. He stood still for a moment on the threshold, and glancing at the whole party, went straight up to the elder, guessing him to be their host. He made him a low bow and asked his blessing. Father Zossima, rising in his chair, blessed him. Dmitri kissed his hand respectfully, and with intense feeling, almost anger, he said, "Be so generous as to forgive me for having kept you waiting so long. But Smerdyakov, the valet sent me by my father, in reply to my inquiries, told me twice over that the appointment was for one. Now I suddenly learn." "Don't disturb yourself," interposed the elder. "No matter. You are a little late. It's of no consequence. I'm extremely obliged to you, and expected no less from your goodness." Saying this, Dmitri bowed once more. Then, turning suddenly towards his father, made him, too, a similarly low and respectful bow. He had evidently considered it beforehand, and made this bow in all seriousness, thinking it his duty to show his respect and good intentions. Although Fyodor Pavlovitch was taken unawares, he was equal to the occasion. In response to Dmitri's bow, he jumped up from his chair and made his son a bow as low in return. His face was suddenly solemn and impressive, which gave him a positively malignant look. Dmitri bowed generally to all present, and without a word walked to the window with his long, resolute stride, sat down on the only empty chair, near Father Pacy, and, bending forward, prepared to listen to the conversation he had interrupted. Dmitri's entrance had taken no more than 2 minutes, and the conversation was resumed. But this time Miusov thought it unnecessary to reply to Father Pacy's persistent and almost irritable question. "Allow me to withdraw from this discussion," he observed with a certain well-bred nonchalance. "It's a subtle question, too. Here Ivan Fyodorovitch is smiling at us. He must have something interesting to say about that also. Ask him." "Nothing special, except one little remark," Ivan replied at once. "Europe liberals in general, and even our liberal dilettanti, often mix up the final results of socialism with those of Christianity. This wild notion is, of course, a characteristic feature. But it's not only liberals and dilettanti who mix up socialism and Christianity, but, in many cases, it appears, the police, the foreign police, of course, do the same. Your Paris anecdote is rather to the point, Fyodor Alexandrovitch." "I ask your permission to drop this subject altogether," Miusov repeated. "I will tell you instead, gentlemen, another interesting and rather characteristic anecdote of Ivan Fyodorovitch himself. Only 5 days ago, in a gathering here, principally of ladies, he solemnly declared in argument that there was nothing in the whole world to make men love their neighbors, that there was no law of nature that man should love mankind, and that if there had been any love on earth hitherto, it was not owing to a natural law, but simply because men have believed in immortality. Ivan Fyodorovitch added in parenthesis that the whole natural law lies in that faith, and that if you were to destroy in mankind the belief in immortality, not only love, but every living force maintaining the life of the world would at once be dried up. Moreover, nothing then would be immoral. Everything would be lawful, even cannibalism. That's not all. He ended by asserting that for every individual, like ourselves, who does not believe in God or immortality, the moral law of nature must immediately be changed into the exact contrary of the former religious law, and that egoism, even to crime, must become not only lawful but even recognized as the inevitable, the most rational, even honorable outcome of his position. From this paradox, gentlemen, you can judge of the rest of our eccentric and paradoxical friend Ivan Fyodorovitch's theories." "Excuse me," Dmitri cried suddenly. "If I've heard aright, crime must not only be permitted but even recognized as the inevitable and the most rational outcome of his position of every infidel. Is that so or not?" "Quite so," said Father Pacy. "I'll remember it." Having uttered these words, Dmitri ceased speaking as suddenly as he had begun. Everyone looked at him with curiosity. "Is that really your conviction as to the consequences of the disappearance of the faith in immortality?" the elder asked Ivan suddenly. "Yes, that was my contention. There is no virtue if there is no immortality." "You are blessed in believing that, or else most unhappy." "Why unhappy?" Ivan asked, smiling. Because, in all probability, you don't believe yourself in the immortality of your soul, nor in what you have written yourself in your article on church jurisdiction. Perhaps you are right, but I wasn't altogether joking. Ivan suddenly and strangely confessed, flushing quickly. You were not altogether joking, that's true. The question is still fretting your heart, and not answered. But the martyr likes sometimes to divert himself with his despair, as it were driven to it by despair itself. Meanwhile, in your despair, you, too, divert yourself with magazine articles and discussions in society, though you don't believe your own arguments, and with an aching heart mock at them inwardly. That question you have not answered, and it is your great grief, for it clamors for an answer. But can it be answered by me? Answered in the affirmative? Ivan went on asking strangely, still looking at the elder with the same inexplicable smile. If it can't be decided in the affirmative, it will never be decided in the negative. You know that is the peculiarity of your heart, and all its suffering is due to it. But thank the Creator who has given you a lofty heart capable of such suffering, of thinking and seeking higher things, for our dwellings is in the heavens. God grant that your heart will attain the answer on earth, and may God bless your path. The elder raised his hand and would have made the sign of the cross over Ivan from where he stood, but the latter rose from his seat, went up to him, received his blessing, and kissing his hand went back to his place in silence. His face looked firm and earnest. This action and all the preceding conversation, which was so surprising from Ivan, impressed everyone by its strangeness and a certain solemnity, so that all were silent for a moment, and there was a look almost of apprehension in Alyosha's face. But Miusov suddenly shrugged his shoulders, and at that same moment Fyodor Pavlovitch jumped up from his seat. "Most pious and holy elder," he cried, pointing to Ivan, "that is my son, flesh of my flesh, the dearest of my flesh. He is my most dutiful Kalmor, so to speak, while this son who has just come in, Dmitri, against whom I am seeking justice from you, is the undutiful Franz Moore. They are both out of Schiller's robbers, and so I am the reigning Count von Moore. Judge and save us. We need not only your prayers, but your prophecies. Speak without buffoonery, and don't begin by insulting the members of your family," answered the elder in a faint, exhausted voice. He was obviously getting more and more fatigued, and his strength was failing. "An unseemly farce which I foresaw when I came here," cried Dmitri indignantly. He too leapt up. "Forgive it, Reverend Father," he added, addressing the elder. "I'm not a cultivated man, and I don't even know how to address you properly. But you have been deceived, and you have been too good-natured in letting us meet here. All my father wants is a scandal. Why he wants it only he can tell. He always has some motive, but I believe I know why." "They all blame me, all of them," cried Fyodor Pavlovitch in his turn. "Pyotr Alexandrovitch here blames me too. You have been blaming me, Pyotr Alexandrovitch, you have." He turned suddenly to Miusov, although the latter was not dreaming of interrupting him. "They all accuse me of having hidden the children's money in my boots and cheated them. But isn't there a court of law? There they will reckon out for you, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, from your notes, your letters, and your agreements, how much money you had, how much you have spent, and how much you have left. Why does Pyotr Alexandrovitch refuse to pass judgment? Dmitri is not a stranger to him, because they are all against me, while Dmitri Fyodorovitch is in debt to me, and not a little, but some thousands of which I have documentary proof. The whole town is echoing with his debaucheries, and where he was stationed before, he several times spent 1,000 or 2 for the seduction of some respectable girl. We know all about that, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, in its most secret details. I'll prove it. Would you believe it, Holy Father? He has captivated the hearts of the most honorable of young ladies of good family and fortune, daughter of a gallant colonel, formerly his superior officer, who had received many honors and had the Anna Order on his breast. He compromised the girl by his promise of marriage. Now she is an orphan, and here she is betrothed to him, yet before her very eyes he is dancing attendance on a certain enchantress. And although this enchantress has lived in, so to speak, civil marriage with a respectable man, yet she is of an independent character, an unapproachable fortress for everybody, just like a legal wife. for she is virtuous. Yes, Holy Fathers, she is virtuous. Dmitri Fyodorovich wants to open this fortress with a golden key, and that's why he's insolent to me now, trying to get money from me. Though he has wasted thousands on this enchantress already, he's continually borrowing money for the purpose. From whom do you think? Shall I say, Mitya? Be silent, cried Dmitri. Wait till I'm gone. Don't dare in my presence to asperse the good name of an honorable girl. That you should utter a word about her is an outrage, and I won't permit it. He was breathless. Mitya, cried Fyodor Pavlovitch hysterically, squeezing out a tear. And is your father's blessing nothing to you? If I curse you, what then? Shameless hypocrite, exclaimed Dmitri furiously. He says that to his father. His father. What would he be with others? Gentlemen, only fancy. There's a poor but honorable man living here, burdened with a numerous family, a captain who got into trouble and was discharged from the army, but not publicly, not by court-martial, with no slur on his honor. And 3 weeks ago, Dmitri seized him by the beard in a tavern, dragged him out into the street, and beat him publicly, and all because he is an agent in the little business of mine. It's all a lie. Outwardly it is the truth, but inwardly a lie. Dmitri was trembling with rage. Father, I don't justify my action. Yes, I confess it publicly. I behaved like a brute to that captain, and I regret it now, and I'm disgusted with myself for my brutal rage. But this captain, this agent of yours, went to that lady whom you call an enchantress and suggested to her from you that she should take IOUs of mine which were in your possession and should sue me for the money so as to get me into prison by means of them if I persisted in claiming an account from you of my property. Now you reproach me for having a weakness for that lady when you yourself incited her to captivate me. She told me so to my face. She told me the story and laughed at you. You wanted to put me in prison because you are jealous of me with her, because you'd begun to force your attentions upon her, and I know all about that too. She laughed at you for that as well, you hear. She laughed at you as she described it. So here you have this man, this father who reproaches his profligate son. Gentlemen, forgive my anger, but I foresaw that this crafty old man would only bring you together to create a scandal. I have come to forgive him if he held out his hand, to forgive him and ask forgiveness. But as he has just this minute insulted not only me, but an honorable young lady, for whom I feel such reverence that I dare not take her name in vain, I have made up my mind to show up his game, though he is my father. He could not go on. His eyes were glittering and he breathed with difficulty. But everyone in the cell was stirred. All except Father Zossima got up from their seats uneasily. The monks looked austere but waited for guidance from the elder. He sat still, pale, not from excitement but from the weakness of disease. An imploring smile lighted up his face. From time to time he raised his hands as though to check the storm, and of course a gesture from him would have been enough to end the scene. But he seemed to be waiting for something and watched them intently as though trying to make out something which was not perfectly clear to him. At last Miusov felt completely humiliated and disgraced. "We are all to blame for this scandalous scene," he said hotly. "But I did not foresee it when I came, though I knew with whom I had to deal. This must be stopped at once. Believe me, Your Reverence, I had no precise knowledge of the details that have just come to light. I was unwilling to believe them, and I learned for the first time. A father is jealous of his son's relations with a woman of loose behavior and intrigues with the creature to get his son into prison. This is the company in which I have been forced to be present. I was deceived. I declare to you all that I was as much deceived as anyone." "Dmitri Fyodorovich," yelled Fyodor Pavlovitch suddenly, in an unnatural voice, "if you were not my son, I would challenge you this instant to a duel, with pistols, at 3 paces, across a handkerchief," he ended, stamping with both feet. With old liars who have been acting all their lives, there are moments when they enter so completely into their part that they tremble or shed tears of emotion in earnest, although at that very moment or a second later they are able to whisper to themselves, "You know you are lying, you shameless old sinner. You are acting now, in spite of your holy wrath." Dmitri frowned painfully and looked with unutterable contempt at his father. I thought, he said, in a soft and, as it were, controlled voice, that I was coming to my native place with the angel of my heart, my betrothed, to cherish his old age, and I find nothing but a depraved profligate, a despicable clown. A duel, yelled the old wretch again, breathless and spluttering at each syllable. And you, Pyotr Alexandrovich Miusov, let me tell you that there has never been in all your family a loftier and more honest, you hear, more honest woman than this creature, as you have dared to call her. And you, Dmitri Fyodorovich, have abandoned your betrothed for that creature, so you must yourself have thought that your betrothed couldn't hold a candle to her. That's the woman called a creature. Shameful, broke from Father Iosif. Shameful and disgraceful. Kalganov, flushing crimson, cried in a boyish voice, trembling with emotion. He had been silent till that moment. Why is such a man alive? Dmitri, beside himself with rage, growled in a hollow voice, hunching up his shoulders till he looked almost deformed. Tell me, can he be allowed to go on defiling the earth? He looked round at everyone and pointed at the old man. He spoke evenly and deliberately. Listen, listen, monks to the parricide, cried Fyodor Pavlovich, rushing up to Father Iosif. That's the answer to your shameful. What is shameful? That creature, that woman of loose behavior is perhaps holier than you are yourselves. You monks who are seeking salvation. She fell perhaps in her youth, ruined by her environment, but she loved much, and Christ himself forgave the woman who loved much. It was not for such love Christ forgave her, broke impatiently from the gentle Father Iosif. Yes, it was for such monks, it was. You save your souls here, eating cabbage, and think you are the righteous. You eat a gudgeon a day, and you think you bribe God with gudgeon. This is unendurable, was heard on all sides in the cell. But this unseemly scene was cut short in the most unexpected way. Father Zossima rose suddenly from his seat. Almost distracted with anxiety for the elder and everyone else, Alyosha succeeded, however, in supporting him by the arm. Father Zossima moved towards Dmitri and, reaching him, sank on his knees before him. Alyosha thought that he had fallen from weakness, but this was not so. The elder distinctly and deliberately bowed down at Dmitri's feet till his forehead touched the floor. Alyosha was so astounded that he failed to assist him when he got up again. There was a faint smile on his lips. Goodbye, forgive me, all of you, he said, bowing on all sides to his guests. Dmitri stood for a few moments in amazement. Bowing down to him, what did it mean? Suddenly he cried aloud, "Oh God!" hid his face in his hands, and rushed out of the room. All the guests flocked out after him, in their confusion not saying goodbye, or bowing to their host. Only the monks went up to him again for a blessing. What did it mean, falling at his feet like that? Was it symbolic or what? Said Fyodor Pavlovich, suddenly quieted and trying to reopen conversation without venturing to address anybody in particular. They were all passing out of the precincts of the hermitage at the moment. I can't answer for a madhouse and for madmen, Miusov answered at once ill-humouredly. But I will spare myself your company, Fyodor Pavlovich, and trust me, forever. Where's that monk? That monk, that is, the monk who had invited them to dine with the superior, did not keep them waiting. He met them as soon as they came down the steps from the elder's cell, as though he had been waiting for them all the time. Reverend Father, kindly do me a favor. Convey my deepest respect to the Father Superior. Apologize for me, personally, Miusov, to his reverence, telling him that I deeply regret that owing to unforeseen circumstances I am unable to have the honor of being present at his table, greatly as I should decide to do so, Miusov said irritably to the monk. And that unforeseen circumstance, of course, is myself, Fyodor Pavlovich cut in immediately. Do you hear, Father? This gentleman doesn't want to remain in my company, or else he'd come at once. And you shall go, Pyotr Alexandrovich. Pray go to the Father Superior, and good appetite to you. I will decline, and not you. Home, home. I'll lead at home. I don't feel equal to it here, Pyotr Alexandrovich, my amiable relative. I'm not your relative and never have been, you contemptible man. I said it on purpose to madden you, because you always disclaim the relationship, though you really are a relation in spite of your shuffling. I'll prove it by the church calendar. As for you, Ivan, stay if you like. I'll send the horses for you later. Propriety requires you to go to the Father Superior, Fyodor Alexandrovich, to apologize for the disturbance we've been making. Is it true that you are going home? Aren't you lying? Fyodor Alexandrovich, how could I dare after what's happened? Forgive me, gentlemen. I was carried away, and upset besides, and indeed I am ashamed. Gentlemen, one man has the heart of Alexander of Macedon, and another the heart of the little dog Fido. Mine is that of the little dog Fido. I am ashamed. After such an escapade, how can I go to dinner to gobble up the monastery sauces? I am ashamed. I can't. You must excuse me. The devil only knows what if he deceives us, thought Miusov, still hesitating, and watching the retreating buffoon with distrustful eyes. The latter turned round, and noticing that Miusov was watching him, waved him a kiss. Well, are you coming to the Superior? Miusov asked Ivan abruptly. Why not? I was especially invited yesterday. Unfortunately, I feel myself compelled to go to this confounded dinner, said Miusov with the same irritability, regardless of the fact that the monk was listening. We ought, at least, to apologize for the disturbance and explain that it was not our doing. What do you think? Yes, we must explain that it wasn't our doing. Besides, Father won't be there, observed Ivan. Well, I should hope not. Confound this dinner. They all walked on, however. The monk listened in silence. On the road through the corpse he made one observation, however, that the Father Superior had been waiting a long time, and that they were more than half an hour late. He received no answer. Miusov looked with hatred at Ivan. Here he is, going to the dinner as though nothing had happened, he thought, a brazen face and the conscience of a Karamazov.
Aria Ponze. Aria Ponze. Now, a concealed thought or intention, an ulterior motive. Ultramontanism. Ultramontanism. Now, a school of thought of the Catholic Church which promoted supreme papal authority in matters of spirituality and governance. Predicate. Predicate. Verb. State, affirm, or assert something about the subject of a sentence or an argument of a proposition, found or base something on. Sallowness. Sallowness. Now, of a person's face or complexion, quality of an unhealthy yellow or pale brown color. Irascible. Irascible. Adjective, having or showing a tendency to be easily angered. Irreproachable. Irreproachable. Adverb, in a way beyond criticism. Faultless. Parenthesis. Parenthesis. Now, a word or phrase inserted as an explanation or afterthought into a passage which is grammatically complete without it, in writing usually marked off by brackets, dashes, or commas. An interlude or interval. Asperse. Asperse. Verb, attack or criticize the reputation or integrity of. Parricide. Parricide. Now, the killing of a parent or rather near relative. Brazen. Brazen. Adjective, bold and without shame.